war was, in fact, it was like, as I have later learned, all civil wars are tripartite. There are two parts that are fighting, and they enter history. They're fighting to see who picks up the share of power. Then there's the general population, who they both want to destroy. In the Spanish Civil War, there was a popular revolution, and the Stalin-backed republic and the fascists first combined, along with the Western democracies, to destroy the popular revolution. And after that was done, they picked up the spoils, fought to pick up the spoils, which is not an unusual pattern. And though I can't claim to have understood it in any depth at the time, I could already see the picture. By the time the Stalin-Hitler pact came along and the information about the purges, it was impossible to take any of this seriously. I was also anti-Leninist because it struck me at the time that, however horrifying the Stalinist crimes were, they clearly had their origins in Leninist authoritarianism. I was also quite skeptical about Marxism, not so much the particular ideas as the concept of any movement that is named after a person already arouses skepticism. It suggests at once that it's a form of organized religion or something like that. So, for example, in physics, there's nothing like Einsteinism. And in any serious domain, you don't personalize collections of beliefs. And that immediately set me off. Later learned more about it.
This almost sounds like wisdom in hindsight.
It is.
And it was quite extraordinary at that period in the 1940s, when you consider the circle that you were living in and moving in, for you perhaps not to have what was known as the Russian phase. I mean, you didn't have your revolution with Spain.
And I don't want to exaggerate. I was about 10 years old at the time. The first article I wrote, first political article, was actually for a school newspaper, and it was on the fall of Barcelona. And I don't want to pretend I knew what was going on, but I had some sense of it. And as I say, shortly after, I had the luck, I think in retrospect, to have become close to anarchist circles, which were quite lively at the time. And it was a very lively, vibrant, exciting period of political culture and working class culture.
You still describe yourself as an anarchist and as a libertarian socialist. To many people these days, these are rather arcane expressions, almost from another age. And what do they mean to you?
What they mean is the search for, actually it's an outgrowth of classical liberalism. It's classical liberalism adapted to the modern period. Anarchism is not a fixed set of ideas. It's a tendency in human thought that is trying to identify kinds of authority and domination, and to, if they can't justify themselves, which they rarely can, to work to overcome them. That means overcoming state authority. It also means overcoming the autocracy of capitalist enterprise, which is simply another form of hierarchy and domination. It means overcoming sexist repression, or whatever you find. Sometimes authority can be justified. So, for example, if you stop a 3-year-old kid from running across the street in traffic, that's authority, but I think you can give a justification for it. However, the burden of proof is always on those with the authority. They have to demonstrate that their authority and control is legitimate, and that justification can very rarely be given.
So what you're saying, that any structure, any institution, no matter what, should be challenged.
Any institution of authority and domination, institutions of cooperation, voluntary association, federation, and so on, I think they don't have that burden of proof. And in fact, I would want, and in fact, I believe that if you read the classical liberal texts, 18th century, seriously, and apply them to the current age, this is what you discover. Adam Smith, if everyone reads the first paragraph, which talks about how wonderful division of labor is, but very few people get to maybe page 500 or wherever it is, where he says that the end result of division of labor is going to be to turn human beings into something as stupid and ignorant as any person can be, and that civilized society, the government or someone will have to intervene to prevent the horrendous effects of the invisible hand.
As a libertarian socialist, though, what do you make of the received wisdom today that socialism is dead? It's had it.
Well, let's take the various parts of the world. What was called socialism in Eastern Europe was killed by late 1917 or early 1918. Every socialist tendency that had developed in the pre-Bolshevik period was immediately extirpated, including Soviet workers' factory councils. Any popular organization was wiped out. So since then, there hasn't been a trace of socialism in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet system. In the West, there have been, there's kind of a slow, there's a move towards a kind of a social democratic state capitalism of some kind or other in various places. The basic ideas of socialism are in the future. Socialism is based on traditional socialism. Is based on the application of Enlightenment ideals to a industrial society, and it means that workers will control production, communities will control communities, and so on. That's socialism if it means anything.
Okay, so your brand of libertarian socialism, has that existed anywhere?
Well, it's a little bit like asking whether democracy existed anywhere. Bits and pieces of it, yes. I mean, you look around the world, there are bits and pieces of democracy. In the United States, there are elements of democracy, very limited elements, but real ones. So it's an improvement over the 17th century, let's say. The American Revolution was hugely flawed in many ways. In fact, if a third world country today were to promulgate the U.S. Constitution, we would regard it as a reversion to Nazism. That Constitution identifies a group of people as 3/5 humans, for example. But nevertheless, in the context of the time, it was a tremendous advance. And the struggle for freedom is unending. You cross one bridge, you find other barriers. So there are bits and pieces of democracy. There are bits and pieces of popular control. There are new forms of authority and domination that we didn't notice before.
Could we move on to what it seems had the greatest impact on your life, and that was the Vietnam War, or as you've described it, the American War against Asia. Can you give me something of the impact that had on your life?
Actually, it had virtually no impact on my thinking, but it did have an impact on my action. There just came a point where it seemed impossible to look in the mirror and continue with a very pleasant life that I was leading. I mean, I had a fine professional life. I loved my work, a career, family, this and that, everything, and there were plenty of things to protest about, and I had individually discussed and protested them. But the Vietnam War by the early 1960s was becoming a real monstrosity.
And you made a conscious decision then?
It was a very conscious and a difficult decision because I knew I was giving up a lot, and you can't put your foot in without starting to swim. You begin, and it's obvious that it's going to go on, and there'll be more demands, and so on. I should say at the time that I got started, I thought it was totally hopeless. The early talks that I was giving in say, 1964 were to audiences of 4 people in some church where one was the organizer, and one was the local minister, and one was a drunk who wandered off the streets, and the 4th one was somebody who wanted to kill you. And in fact, as late as 1966 in Boston, which is a liberal city, we could not have public meetings against the war without them being physically attacked. The first major public talk I gave on the Boston Common, which is the standard place for giving outdoor talks, this was late 1965. The 3 or 4 of us who were speaking had to be protected by hundreds of police.
And yet you later wrote that you had quite a profound distaste for activism. So you were a reluctant activist. So
There's nothing I hate more than giving general public talks.
It was during this time in the Vietnam War that you developed what you're most acclaimed for, and probably what you're most attacked for, and that is your skill at debunking the language of the state, the newspeak of the state, the lies of the state. Can you give me some idea of what the subtlety of the propaganda was then? Because,
first of all, I don't think propaganda was very subtle. I think it was extremely crude and transparently false, but very effective. Let's take the general framework. It's just 30 years ago, 1962, John F. Kennedy sent the American Air Force to bomb South Vietnam. Now, it was not a secret. So in October 1962, the New York Times had a front-page story in which they said 30% of the missions against South Vietnam have American pilots flying them. Well, there was no pretense at that time that we were attacked, that anyone was involved except us and the South Vietnamese, and we were attacking the South Vietnamese. 30 years have gone by. It has never been described in the mainstream as an attack against South Vietnam. It is always the defense of South Vietnam. And then people debate whether the defense of South Vietnam was wise or unwise for us. But, the very phrase attack against South Vietnam is inexpressible. I mean, it's as if the Russian tyranny hadn't fallen apart, suppose Brezhnev's system had been maintained. And imagine that 30 years after the invasion of Afghanistan, no one had ever referred to an attack against Afghanistan. Everyone had referred to it as a defense of Afghanistan against terror supported from the outside. Well, that's what we're living in. We wouldn't call that subtle propaganda if we saw it in Russia. We would regard it as pure totalitarianism, but that's what we're living in.
How powerful are these terms of the state? And well, we've used in this country and in the United States the terms extremist and moderate.
Yeah.
They crop up on the news regularly. And in the same way that people can be tagged, so nations can be tagged, so movements can be tagged.
Well, here we have to be a little more differentiated. I mean, in educated circles, what, if we were honest, we've been called the commissar class. They're taken very seriously. So, for example, take again the Vietnam case. No one in the commissar class, no journalist, no intellectual, no writer, can simply express the truth that the United States attacked South Vietnam. That's inexpressible. In fact, I've been looking at the American press and scholarly literature carefully for 30 years now to see if anybody can say it. If you say it, then I understand what you're talking about. Take, say, moderate. That is a very definite meaning. So, for example, in the mid-1930s, Hitler was a moderate. He was described as a moderate.
Who described him as that?
The American government. He was both in internal documents and even publicly. He was described as a moderate standing between the extremists of the right and left. And therefore we had to support him. Mussolini was a moderate all the time. Saddam Hussein was a moderate. In the late 1980s, I think now, for the news, he was described as a moderate contributing to stability. General Suharto of Indonesia is described in the press regularly. In 1965, when he came into power, slaughtering maybe 700,000 people, the New York Times and other journals described him as the leader of the Indonesian moderates. Today, the London Economist describes him as at heart benign. This is a mass murder on the style of Saddam Hussein.
And yet you're often described as an extremist.
Sure, I am an extremist, because a moderate is anyone who supports Western power, and an extremist is anyone who objects to them.
Now, you've had some quite spectacular rounds. Arthur Schlesinger accused you of betraying the intellectual tradition.
True. I agree with it.
You agree with it?
Servility to power. And if I didn't betray it, I would be ashamed of myself.
Because around this time, you'd accused Schlesinger and others of being what you called a secular priest.
Well, let's take Schlesinger.
I was going to say a secular priesthood because you were identifying a whole class. You were saying the liberal intelligentsia of America are in bed with the U.S. government in some of its more vicious policies around as they applied around the world.
I should say
quite an accusation.
Well, and I've tried to document it. In fact, I've written thousands of pages of documentation, and I think they show the point. Actually, the term secular priesthood I borrowed from Isaiah Berlin, who applied it to the Russian commissar class. And I think it's correct. They're a secular priesthood, and we have one too, namely the educated sector.
Can I just interrupt there a second? Because Do you use the term commissar, secular priesthood, borrowed from the Russian experience, and Stalinist when you describe the Western? So you do that to infuriate them?
No, I do it to be accurate. I think that the term commissar is a useful one. There is the dominance in virtually any country you look at. The respected and respectable intellectuals are those who serve external power. We may honor the Soviet dissidents, but internally they were not honored. They were reviled. The people who were honored were the commissars. And this goes all the way back in history. Let's take the Bible. The people who were honored in the Bible were the false prophets. It was the ones we call the prophets who were jailed and driven into the desert and so on. That's typical and entirely understandable. We should have the honesty to look at ourselves by the standards we quite easily apply to others. So if, say, a British intellectual writes vulgar apologetics for U.S. government atrocities, that's no different than if an American intellectual wrote vulgar apologetics for Stalin. And it happens all the time.
The last time I saw you speak in South London, you defended very vigorously the right of a man to have his say, a heckler. And he happened to be a man of neo-fascist views. Does that right of free expression, in your view, extend to everybody?
I mean, if we don't believe in free expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all.
Let me take another example. Recently, Muslim extremists, the last few years, Muslim extremists in this country were actually allowed to call for the death of Salman Rushdie. Would you support their right to speak in that way?
To speak, yes, but I think that Bentham's standard is the one that should be observed. If suppose two people walk into a store, suppose you and I walk into a store and you have a gun, and I tell you, shoot the store owner. Well, that's speech, but it's not protected, because that's speech which is part of a violent act.
But shouldn't that be, as in the case of the racists being allowed to speak, shouldn't that be simply, and indeed it is in this country, illegal? I mean, it's incitement to murder.
You have to ask whether it's incitement to imminent violent action. Now, you know, there's no precise litmus test that tells you where to draw the line. But freedom of speech is enough, so that you need an extraordinary argument to overcome it. And I think there are such cases. I gave one. For example, somebody says shoot when someone else has a gun. Okay, that's crossing the line. But I don't think there are many cases that cross the line. And in fact, it was kind of interesting to watch the British reaction to Rushdie's case. I went to court, and the court ruled, I don't know the exact wording, that the Islamic community brought it to the court saying that Rushdie should be regarded as subject to the equivalent of seditious libel. And the court ruled that if he had criticized the Queen and the Anglican Church, if he had mocked them, then he would be subjected to penalty. But it was only
yes, it was selected. But
okay,
still, that doesn't detract from the fact that the principal person actually burning Rushdie's books, organizing that, and calling for his death was inciting to murder.
Yeah. And
you wouldn't defend his right to do that.
Well, I agree that we're getting near the border. I mean, if we got to the point where someone said shoot, and there's Rushdie standing over there, that's not protected. If it's somebody making a speech saying, I think he ought to be killed, somebody makes a speech saying they think I ought to be killed, I don't think they ought to be stopped from making that speech. Now, you know, exactly how you make these decisions is a subtle matter, but it seems to me protection of the right of freedom of speech is extremely important.
Do your enemies have a certain value to you? Do you judge perhaps the success of what you're doing by the intensity of attacks on you?
Well, I mean, I would sort of weigh it in balance. For example, if I started to be praised,
you're doing by the intensity of attacks on you?
Well, I mean, I would sort of weigh it in balance. For example, if I started to be praised by establishment sectors, I would ask seriously whether I'm not doing something wrong. Why are they praising me? However, again, it's not a litmus test. There's a personal cost, of course.
There's something else, isn't there? Because I read that while your colleagues and friends from the 60s, you said many, perhaps most of them, had burned out, you'd kept going, and that inside you felt often frustration and anger. On the surface, you're a very gentle person.
First of all, I don't think you should underestimate compensation. The country is a very different country than it was 30 years ago. It is a much more civilized country. Outside of educated circles, it's a much more civilized country. Now, that's not because of me, but it's because of thousands of people doing local organizing and actions of various kinds. And I can play a role in what they do. Many of those people need someone, groups need someone to come in and give a talk or do some research or be in a demonstration or something. And there's tremendous compensation for doing that.
Well, assuming history hasn't ended, where is the next popular movement coming from?
Well, I think there are many of them. Take the environmental issues. They're not. You can't play games with that anymore. We're reaching the point where the question of human survival may be at stake. But there's a core question which has not been addressed, and that's the question of power in the state economic nexus. That's basically the question of corporate power. We have to revive the understanding of the 18th and 19th century that autocratic control of the economic system is intolerable. There's a major attack on democracy going on in the world, an absolutely major attack. Decisions about human life are being raised to a level so high that even parliaments are not influencing them. There's a kind of a de facto world government being established, which involves the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT and the G7 meetings, so on, executive agreements, which are being designed to be insulated from any form of popular pressure. They do serve interests. They reflect something real. They reflect the internationalization of the economy. They reflect the interests of transnational corporations, international banks, and so on. The people talk about the end of history, but what they're seeing is a tremendous attack on democracy, and that has to be understood and struggled against. That's a big problem.
Noam Chomsky, thank you.